Hey guys, it's Spyros from the Self-Help Photographer. I am here with the Pentax K-50 hands-on review. Now I want to start by telling you how surprised I consistently was by the K-50. This camera is frankly an astonishing camera, and the short review is that this is a great camera, and if you're considering buying anything like a Nikon D5200 or a Canon T5i, I would recommend you take a serious look at the Pentax K-50. It is an astonishingly good camera. I'm going to start with the specs. What we're dealing with here is an APS-C censored camera, 16.1 megapixels. The camera weighs 650 grams, has a stereo microphone, built-in HDR, shoots up to 6 frames per second, records HD video at 1080p, 30 frames per second, 25 frames per second, and 24 frames per second, 720p at 60, 50, 30, 25, and 24 frames per second for you. This is a weather-sealed camera. In addition to that, the Pentax K-50 has integrated sensor image stabilization. So no matter what lens you're shooting with, you're going to have image stabilization available to you on this camera. And you can buy this camera body only for $700. And it has a built-in intervalometer for time-lapse photography, which is unheard of at this price point. You can get this camera in 120 different color combinations. Now the K-50 is a wonderfully and thoughtfully designed camera, and as I mentioned earlier, it's weather sealed, which you cannot get for $700. Let's start by taking a look at the back of the camera. On the back, you have a handful of well-placed buttons and dials. To the left of the viewfinder, you have the live view button. To the right of the viewfinder, you have the first of 2 control dials, which I love. Dual control dials is another feature that you cannot find on comparably priced cameras. I do have a small quibble with the placement of the back control dial. It is slightly to the left of where the thumb naturally rests on the back of the camera, and to me it would make sense to have the dial right there. Now, it's not a huge deal to slide your thumb over and use that dial. In fact, after about a week, it felt natural to me. But when I use that dial, my thumb is bumping against the frame of my glasses when I have my camera up to the viewfinder. But that's a small quibble. It's still very usable. And again, to have 2 control dials on a camera at $700 is a fantastic value. And then underneath that control dial, you have the autofocus, auto exposure lock button. Below that, you have the image review button. And below that, you have the very common direction pad with the OK confirm button in the center of it. Now, the directional pad buttons serve as access to functions. The center button is your OK or confirm button, and it also has a second function. If you hold down the OK button for about a second, you activate the autofocus grid for focus point selection. This turns the directional buttons around that OK button into the arrow buttons for selecting your autofocus point. This is a really nice built-in feature. It gives you quick access to autofocus control. I both like and dislike the way that this focus point control is implemented, however, because when you activate the focus point selection, you disable the dedicated ISO and other control function buttons around the OK button. And if you're not paying attention, it's easy to forget if you have the focus point selection mode active or inactive. If it's active and you want to do something like change your ISO and you're not paying attention, you might reach to hit that button with your thumb and find that you're moving your focus point instead of changing your ISO. Now, Pentax clearly knew that this was something that could happen because on the back of the screen and in the viewfinder, there is an indicator that tells you whether or not focus point mode is active. And after shooting with the camera for a few days, I was remembering to look for that indication, and if I wanted to change ISO, I knew if I needed to either turn on or turn off autofocus point selection. And all you have to do to exit focus point selection mode is press down and hold that OK button for another second or two, and it goes back to regular control mode. On top of the camera, you have your mode dial, which has all of your standard shooting modes plus a few extras. First, you have the U1 and U2 modes, and these are 2 user programmable modes that allow you to set pretty much any setting you want so that when you flip into that mode, everything is exactly the way you want it. For instance, I might set user 1 to be all of my settings where I would want them to be if I was shooting portraits in the studio using my flashes. Low ISO, I would have my focus point selection set, I would have my white balance set to flash. All of these kinds of things can be pre-programmed, so you just flip the dial and you have everything set. And you have two options for that. This is another feature that the K-50 offers that goes above and beyond comparably priced cameras from Canon and Nikon. In addition to these customizable user modes, you have two other modes that are unusual. One is TAV, which is Shutter and Aperture Priority mode, and the other one is SV, which is Sensitivity or ISO Priority mode. So let me explain how they work. In Shutter and Aperture Priority mode, you set the shutter speed and the aperture on the camera, and the camera will automatically select the ISO appropriate for the shooting situation. Now, this mode is a bit redundant because you can achieve the exact same thing in manual mode by simply turning on the automatic ISO function that's built into the camera. To me, this is probably a mode that isn't necessary, but you can't fault Pentax for putting it on the dial and giving you quick access to it. And sensitivity priority or ISO priority is very similar. It's actually the opposite of shutter and aperture priority. In this situation, you control the ISO and the camera will automatically select the aperture and the shutter speed for that particular shot. Now again, the exact same function is available by using Program Auto, because in Program Auto what happens is you set the ISO and the camera will select the shutter speed and aperture for you. The main difference between those two modes is that in ISO priority mode, the ISO is controlled by one of the thumb dials, which makes it quicker to select your ISO, whereas in Program Auto, you need to go into the ISO menu, select your ISO, confirm it, and then go back into your shooting mode. Now, we're still looking at the top of the camera, and once you get past the mode dial, you have your exposure compensation button, and then you have this green button. And I gotta tell you, when I first saw this green button, I had no idea what it did, but as soon as I figured it out, I was very impressed. This green button is a one-touch zero exposure button, which is really slick because it allows you to pick up the camera, and no matter what your settings were at, you can point it at the scene you want to shoot, hit the green button, and it will set your aperture and shutter speed for a zero exposure. This is excellent in situations where you don't know where your settings are at and you need to get a shot right now and you don't have time to switch the modes or switch the dials or switch anything. Now that in and of itself is pretty cool, but what's even better is that you can program how this button works depending upon the mode you're in. In manual mode, you can set it to either set your aperture and shutter speed to a zero exposure, or you can set it to just change the aperture or just change the shutter speed to bring everything in line for a zero exposure. This gives you an incredible amount of flexibility in a camera that again is priced comparably with Canon and Nikon cameras that do not give you this level of control. Once you get past the exposure compensation button and the green button, you have the shutter button and your power switch, and then in front of that, right where it belongs, is the secondary control dial. And then over on the left side of the camera, you have three buttons. The flash pop-up, a customizable quality and file format button, which allows you to switch from one format to the other at the push of a button. Again, another level of customization that is built into this camera very thoughtfully. Now, I know that I've just spent a lot of time talking about the controls of this camera, but I really wanted you guys to understand the amount of thoughtful customization and control that has been built into this camera. Supporting that is the menu system of the camera. Now, I'm not going to take you on a detailed tour of the menus. What I am going to tell you is that the Pentax menu system is easy to navigate, it is well thought out, and it is easy to access the controls that you need, which is important considering the level of customization that is offered by this camera. Let's talk about the holy grail of photography. Let's talk about the image quality. As I mentioned earlier, this camera is an APS-C sized sensor. So this is a crop sensor camera. It has 16.1 megapixels. And people might fault this camera for being only 16.1 megapixels. But before you start knocking this camera, think about it. Megapixels are most important when you're getting into printing very large prints. And even at 16 megapixels, you can print large prints. So unless you're printing huge prints, I'm talking like 4, 5, 6 feet, you don't need 24 or 36 megapixels. 16 will do the trick just fine. In the standard ISO test here in the studio, the K-50 did great. You can take this camera up to 51,200 ISO, which is a tremendous level of sensitivity. activity. And as you would expect, at that high an ISO, you get a tremendous amount of noise and a great deal of quality degradation. When looking at the sample photos, which you can take a look at over on Flickr, you can read detail at 25,600 ISO. Now, this isn't a super usable photo because it's tremendously noisy, and if you're looking at fine text and fine details, there is definitely degradation there. But in looking at these, I would say 6400 is a definitely usable ISO, and depending upon the situation, you might even be able to get away with using 12,800 and getting some good shots. Now, I also, of course, put the K-50 through the bar band test in some truly crappy lighting, and in that situation, it also performed very admirably. I shot predominantly at 3200 and 6400 ISO. Nice details, nice colors, nice dynamic range. I was impressed. I took a few at 12,800. They were okay. They weren't great. They weren't terrible. Probably not something I would want to print, but if I wanted to get the shot, I would not hesitate to go to 12,800 ISO because, as I've said before, I would rather have a noisy shot than have no shot at all. Let's talk a little bit about the autofocus system. The K-50 has 11 autofocus points, 9 of which are cross-type, and it uses the Sapphire 9 focusing system. Never, when I was shooting with this camera, did I have a problem with hunting and getting focus. It always grabbed focus, and it was always quite fast to do so. Surprisingly, live view focus on the K-50 was much better than what is currently available out there. Now, I say currently available because the 70D has not hit the market yet, and we need to see just how good the new dual pixel live focusing is from Canon. That being said, the K-50 offers the best live view autofocusing that I have used on a camera. Now, in addition to shooting at the bar, I also went around town and took some shots there, and I shot some portraits in the studio with the K-50. And in all cases, I was very impressed with the image quality. Again, sharp, crisp, clean details, great colors. This camera has proven to be a joy to use. Now, one thing that doesn't stand out compared to other cameras in its class on this camera is the movie mode. In terms of the quality, it's good. I mentioned you've got 1080p at 30, 25, and 24 frames per second, 720p at 60, 50, 30, 25, and 24 frames per second. The quality is not the issue, but there are a couple of limitations to the video on the K-50. Number one, there is no external microphone jack. So for serious video shooters, this probably isn't a huge deal because you're probably capturing your audio separate from the camera anyway, and that's fine. If you're not really big into video, that's not going to be a big deal, but if you want a balance of video and still shooting, that's something that's worth considering. Another limitation of the video mode on the K-50 is the fact that you can only use up to 3200 ISO. I was a little bit surprised by this because Pentax has built so much functionality into this camera. Now, I imagine they did that because the video quality at 6400 and 12,800 and above is probably pretty crappy, which is to be expected. We found the same thing on the D7100 and the D7000. Even the D600 didn't perform super great at high ISO video recording. Now, I did shoot some dim in the dark video. I took this into my basement, which is lit just by the windows, the basement windows shining light in, and because of the ISO limitations, I was only able to capture underexposed video. Despite that, it was actually quite good. You can see colors, you can see some details, and while it was noisy, it was not so horribly noisy that you couldn't discern details and information in the video. One thing I have not yet mentioned about this camera is that it has focus peaking, which is available in live view mode. This is awesome. I really love focus peaking, especially if you're into manual focusing. I do have one quibble with the focus peaking on the K-50, which is that the focus peaking is indicated by white haloing around the edges of the object that is in focus. I would prefer if that was another color, a bright red or a vibrant green, something that would really stand out, because sometimes I had a hard time figuring out exactly where the peaking was taking place and whether or not what I wanted to be in focus was actually in focus. That being said, the inclusion of focus peaking is a very nice feature, and with some practice and use, it's going to be very easy to get very good at manual focusing with this camera. In the end, I'm sounding like a broken record. I am very impressed with this camera. Very impressed with the capabilities, the features, and the controls, and the performance of the Pentax K-50. $700 for the body. Again, puts it directly in line with the Canon T5i and the Nikon D5200. And in almost every case, I found the K-50 to be a superior camera. Where does it not beat those cameras? Video mode and the size of the sensor, your megapixels. Frankly, the K-50 is a gem of a camera. The image quality is excellent, very good high ISO performance, sharp, vibrant, colorful photos, looked very, very good. It was a joy to use, tremendous amount of control, customization, and flexibility on this camera. All right, guys, that's all I've got for you. I know this was a long review video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about the K-50 or photography in general, use the links down in the description. Do me a favor, down in the comments, Pentax shooters sound off. And those of you who shoot Canon and Nikon, tell me, would you ever consider a Pentax now that you know a little bit more about the K-50? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. Most importantly, you guys, get out there and take some damn photos. I will see you guys next Tuesday with the review of the Pentax Q7 mirrorless camera.